Hi, this is ECG3, and this is just to show you where you can find some ECG videos, easy to access. That they're actually all on YouTube, but I've put them all on my cardiopulmonary PT wiki. You can get there cardiopulmonarypt.wiki.uml.edu, and then scroll down to the ECG video link. You can also find this page through my personal wiki, sean-collins.wiki.uml.edu, and then this is linked from the home page. um, so these are videos that are on YouTube that I use in any class I teach that uses ECG, just because they're easy to access and see. Quick, showing you quick here. We've got a video of PACs. So what you see here is that we've got a QRS, a QRS, a QRS, and then all of a sudden we've got a QRS that occurs earlier than we expected. So that earlier than we expected is a sign of a preatrial contraction. We get a biphasic P wave, which is also an indication that this is an abnormally generated beat. This is a preatrial contraction. It's an ectopic focus in the atria that is precipitating this depolarization of the ventricle. Depending on how far away it is from the previous QRS complex, there may be a small amount of blood ejected from the heart that leads to a weaker pulse wave. There may be very little blood at all ejected, sort of like an inefficient beat of the heart. But they're generally considered to be relatively benign, and they don't, unless there's some pathological process precipitating them that worsens, then they typically, you might have a few and then they might go away. If you've ever been told you have a skipped beat or an extra beat, this might be the underlying cause of that scenario. Now, if the ectopic focus in the atria gets more regular but not nonstop, you might get something called supraventricular tachycardia, where your heart rate suddenly accelerates, and you might feel a palpitation in your chest associated with the fact that your heart's beating faster than it expects to, and that is the rate is usually not any higher than during moderate exercise. But because you're not exercising, you're not getting the venous return to fill the heart, so it feels a little funky. Um, if the pre-atrial contractions progress to a non-stop ectopic focus, then there isn't enough time for the AV node to respond to every single one of those ectopic foci, and that's when you get atrial flutter. So here we're seeing atrial flutter, and we've got non-stop ectopic foci leading to this classic sawtooth or shark tooth pattern of atrial flutter. And usually we can talk about, well, people will say that it's atrial flutter with a certain ratio of flutter waves to QRS complexes. So this is a 4-to-1 ratio of flutter to QRS. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 flutter waves. You can see that the flutter waves basically make it difficult to discern whether there's any T wave. This doesn't last very long, as I said in the previous video. It doesn't last very long because it's a lot of work for the atria. They eventually are tired of working so hard for the amount of blood they're getting, and they decompensate into ventricular fibrillation. So this is what atrial fibrillation looks like. And atrial fibrillation, you've got no discernible P waves, and you've got this occasional QRS complex. It leads to a very irregular pulse rate. It's an irregularly irregular pulse rate. So one thing to comment on from up here is that this is a regular pulse rate, pulse rhythm, a regular pulse rhythm. And the PACs can lead to an abnormal pulse rhythm. Every now and then you get an extra beat. Atrial fibrillation is an irregularly irregular pulse rhythm. PVCs result in a regularly irregular pulse rhythm, and what we have is an occasional ectopic focus in the ventricle that suddenly shoots a very large and malformed looking QRS complex, but we do not call it a QRS complex. We call it a preventricular contraction. It's not precipitated by a P wave. Here's a P wave, here's a T wave, and then all of a sudden we've got this depolarization of the ventricular cells. This can decompensate, and you can start to have them more frequently. This is definitely worse. Remember that with these QRS complexes, you're not getting much cardiac output or stroke volume. So the more frequent the PVCs, the lower the cardiac output, because you get more stroke volume, you get more beats of the heart with a low stroke volume. If you have these occur more frequently, here we see 3 in a row, it starts to be called a run of V-tach. So a run of V-tach is when you have at least 3 PVCs in a row. So preventricular contractions, an ectopic focus in the ventricle, 3 beats in a row, 3 action potentials in a row is a run of V-tach. It's non-sustained V-tach, and the terminology non-sustained V-tach really is for when you have you go from V-tach back to a normal sinus rhythm. If you go from V-tach to V-fib, then you don't call it non-sustained V-tach, even though it didn't stay V-tach. Nobody stays in V-tach. They either go into V-fib or they go back to normal sinus rhythm. The run of V-tach is named based upon the number of action potentials, the number of PVCs. So this is a run of 3. If you had 20, it would be a run of 20. Here's ventricular tachycardia, a very serious condition. We do not have, in this situation, we do not have cardiac output, at least eventually. It might start with some cardiac output, but you eventually will not have cardiac output. This progresses to what is called pulseless ventricular tachycardia. So there's no pulse after a little while with this, because there's no cardiac output. No cardiac output means no blood pressure. Remember that blood pressure equals cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. So if you have no cardiac output, you have no blood pressure. With no cardiac output, you get no delivery of blood to the heart. With no delivery of blood to the heart, cardiac cells start to get ischemic, injured, and die. And now we're set up for the conditions of ventricular fibrillation, which is what this is showing. The one problem I have with this video is that there is no heart rate with ventricular fibrillation. This is because this monitor is recording, and occasionally one of these waveforms goes high enough to be captured and thought of as a heartbeat, when it really is not a heartbeat. When ventricular fibrillation starts, it's very wavy, because we've got fewer ectopic foci, and as those ectopic foci divide up and become multiple ectopic foci. So let's say we have 100 ectopic foci when ventricular fibrillation first starts. Each of those hundreds will divide and become 1,000 ectopic foci, and then they'll all divide and become 100,000 ectopic foci. So we keep having division of the ectopic foci, and the pattern changes from being what's called coarse ventricular fibrillation to fine ventricular fibrillation. So this is coarse ventricular fibrillation, and here we have an example of fine ventricular fibrillation. And this will progress until the waveform is completely flat, and that is asystole, when there's no electrical activity whatsoever. So here's ST depression. If you remember, this is an indication of cardiac ischemia. I encourage you to go to the wiki and watch through that. Here's ST elevation, an indication of cardiac injury and possibly progression to infarction, but infarction is ruled in later. Then we have cardiac arrest. So this one here I'll sort of make big and we'll talk about it as we go through it. So first we see the person is having ST elevation, and ST elevation usually leads to myocardial infarction. If somebody has ST elevation that leads to myocardial infarction, it can be called ST elevation myocardial infarction. Myocardial cells are injured. Because they're injured, they start to throw multifocal PVCs. Multifocal PVCs mean we've got preventricular contractions from more than one location. We now see we get 2 in a row from the same location because they look the same. Continue with the cardiac irritability, having all these multifocal PVCs. And now we have ventricular tachycardia. We finally got irritated enough that one of these ectopic foci just took over and started to create action potentials without stopping. After a while, that degrades into coarse ventricular fibrillation. If the person is not defibrillated, they will, at this point, they will die from this point. There's really no way to get out of this unless they're defibrillated. This is why there are automatic external defibrillators in all the airports now. And fine ventricular fibrillation, we have more and more parts of the myocardium dead, and we have more and more parts of the myocardium that are just not making any electrical activity at all until we finally get to asystole, where there's absolutely no cardiac electrical activity. You cannot be defibrillated out of asystole. If you are defibrillated out of asystole, you weren't in asystole, you just had really fine ventricular fibrillation. So I encourage you all to watch these videos. You do not need to watch the pacing videos at this point, but the videos leading up to pacing, the major arrhythmias and the ST segment depression, and then finally the cardiac arrest pulls it all together, allows you to think through what's happening on the electrocardiogram and what it means for what's happening for the patient who's wearing the electrocardiogram. So I hope these have been helpful. And PT students, I look forward to seeing you in the lab. EP students, please let Dr. Fox know if you have any questions that you need me to answer. Maybe she can collect all the questions and then provide them to me, and I can sort of come up with answers for them. Or maybe I could come to one of your seminars for just a short period of time to answer some questions. Okay, thank you very much.